Full enough house?
Full enough house. Yeah, this was a wild one. This was a really wild one. So I'm going to give you my, if you don't mind, I'm going to give you kind of my introduction to this problem, Adam, and then maybe we can back up and get your introduction to this problem and kind of go forward from there. Because my intro to the problem was I coming into the office and I think on a meeting, and Robert came up to me, Robert of Holistic Engineer fame. So we can ring the chime, even though people on YouTube
the much loved chime,
the much loved chime. We've heard your comment on YouTube, and we'll be ringing the chime a lot. We will be making as many possible references to previous episodes. But Robert of Holistic Engineer fame came up to me with a wild look in his eyes, and I mean, Adam, you have known Robert for a very long time.
Yeah.
A wild look in the eyes is not common from Robert. I mean, that alone is enough to, recall just to get that chime really working. During when we had the data center reboot, when we rebooted the data center, Robert was the one who was actually like keel in the water. Cool. I was the one that I thought I was going to pass out or vomit on my keyboard. But Robert was actually like the cool head in the room.
No, if Robert's panicking, it's because the fire station itself has burned down.
That's right. So Robert comes up to me with a wild look in his eyes, and I was clearly on a call, but it was like, so okay. I mean, obviously, yes, Robert, what is it? And Robert says, if I attempt to write to a device address via MDU-KW, do you think it'll let me? And I'm like, where are we right now? Did you ever watch Quantum Leap, that show?
Yes. I couldn't quote, chapter and verse from it, but yeah.
I can, Matt, have you ever, Matt, I'm sorry as a token millennial, can you, does Quantum Leap ring any bells? As we've learned in previous episodes, if it wasn't featured on SpongeBob, it might not have leapt the generational chasm. I can't imagine that it would.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So Cliff, you've heard of Quantum Leap.
I'm familiar with it. Yeah. We had reruns on satellite.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so the Quantum Leap was a pretty interesting show because the guy would travel into someone else's body, and part of in the beginning of the show, he's trying to figure out where am I? I've arrived in a new body and I've got no idea. Clearly this body knows something that's going on. I felt like that. I had that feeling of okay, I've been transported into the middle of this problem where we are asking if writing to device memory is going via. So what Robert is asking is if I do a write via the kernel debugger, MDB-KW, and MDB is our debugger, MDB-K is running it such as it's debugging the kernel. The W flag denotes I want to actually write to memory, which is obviously wait a minute, is that is this a debugger or is this a destroyer? It's line gets blurry.
That's right. But any idea that is MDB-KW, it's it raises certain goosebumps, right? Like that.
What is the craziest thing you've done via MDB-KW, Adam?
I have changed locking primitives so that everyone gets a lock. That's the. I've just changed it so that it doesn't just whoever wants a lock gets a lock.
Now this was not on a production system, one assumes.
No.
Right, what is the craziest thing you've done on a production system?
Probably changed an instruction to to bounce over a a condition basically. But that it feels very sticky because you're if I have computed this instruction incorrectly, we're going to bounce into outer space.
That's right. For me, it was I changed the branch displacement I changed a particular or I call displacement actually. I change a CV broadcast into a CV signal.
Oof, that's exciting.
Oh, it was super exciting. And this was on definitely a hot customer system where the customer was upset. This is back in Sundays. And you remember Jesse, our dear friend we'd worked with. And this was a customer that he'd been working with. And Jesse got very nervous when I started asking him permission for what I was about to do. He's like, wait, why are you asking me? Like, why are you asking? Why are you so uncertain about what you're about to do? Like, here's the surgeon is not supposed to be asking me these kinds of questions. Why is the surgeon asking me permission in this regard? Like,
and just to roll it back, you're like, I'm seeing this thundering herd. So what if instead of waking up everybody, we just wake up somebody and exactly.
And
like that could be fine.
Assuming I've calculated all this correctly, assuming that I turned this CV broadcast into a call to CV signal and not a call into the middle of an illegal instruction or anything else that I could turn it into.
And you're probably like, well, if it does wedge up the system, I could probably turn it back and maybe the system will unwedge too.
I did not really have I kind of knew that there was no insurance policy on this one. This video was going to be kind of a one-way trip. And I did start asking Jesse, what are the consequences of this? If this system were to reboot right now, what would be the consequences? And Jesse's like, not good. Like, why are you asking me that? That's a weird question to ask me. It's like, it's like your surgeon asking you, just like, your affairs are in order. So I mean, like you've got
like you do have a will, right? I mean, obviously,
obviously you got a will. I mean, my God, right. you clearly done the most basic adult things. You're like,
I feel like it's more like your dentist asking that, but yeah.
It's like your dentist asking you that. Why? This is a super, do you ask this for? No, just like this is a pretty, I don't know, this is a little adventurous, this one. This root canal is a little more adventurous than the ones I've done. And I just want to make sure just asking you your affairs are in order. You've got like, you don't want your kids to be able to, they're already going to be devastated enough having lost a parent. You don't want them to be financially ruined. You're like, what? No. So it worked, I'd like to say. It all worked. And I was relieved and then maybe too relieved. Jesse thought I was a little too relieved and realized that I should not have allowed you to do that. Okay, so Robert is asking me if he can write to device memory via MD-KW. And I'm like, if it did allow you to do that, that itself would be a bug. Like, what do you want to do? And what Robert quickly explained, and Will, this is where we're going to jump to you to get more context, is like, he said, so this is a customer system. We have lost contact with all service processors. And I'm like, what do you mean all? It's like every compute sled. We cannot talk to the service processor on any compute sled. Hosts are up, but all service processors are at this point, like I can say, oh yeah, the wild look is definitely merited. And so what Robert wanted to do, so what the first thing, what we needed to figure out, and again, we'll go to you to get more context on all of this. And I know, Matt, you jumped in here too. We wanted to determine, how dead is the service processor actually? And how can we get what we can tell? Because the service processor is connected to the network. And what we know is we can't reach it over to the network. But we are seemingly. We also know the service processor is in charge of certain basic maintenance of the system. The service processor, among other things, has the thermal loop, which Matt wrote. And we know if the service processor goes out to lunch completely, the fans will all crank up.
Just for a little context, the service processor may be obvious here, but it's the computer within the computer. It's the computer that is driving the basic kind of autonomic functions of the server.
That's right.
And including things like being able to reboot it or the fans, as you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, this is our answer to the baseboard management controller. So we do not have a traditional baseboard management controller for a bunch of good reasons. And what we have instead is a service processor. So but the SP is definitely important. So, and the SP, and we'll go into this in detail, has been designed with an operating system that Cliff led the charge on, Hubris, that is designed to be very robust. And it is really not designed to disappear. It was very unusual that it would disappear. And so the reason for the wild look is that what Robert's kind of bonkers idea was, so it requires a little bit of backstory, but when we boot, the service processor talks to the DIMMs on the box. So there's an I2C bus that the DIMMs, the memory, is connected to, and there's some identifying information in those DIMMs, and it's the service processor that is connected to that bus and gets that information. But the host CPU ultimately needs to get that information in order to train memory. It's got its own I2C initiator, and when it thinks it's talking to the DIMMs, it's actually talking to the service processor. Okay.
With you.
So this only happens when you boot the host CPU. Once it's booted, the I2C controller is like not really used. And one of the things that Robert has discovered over the last, I'm not sure when he made this discovery, but one of the things he's gotten working over the last couple of months is like, this I2C initiator is hidden from, we talked about the kind of the various other chips, the hidden cores on the die, and we and all of those kind of like the hidden things that we don't see. That I2C controller is controlled by one of those hidden cores. And what Robert realized is like, actually, the I2C controller for that thing is actually mapped into our address space, and we, the host operating system, can actually manipulate that I2C controller. So we can initiate I2C, and I'm not even sure, like this kind of defies metaphor. I don't even know. It's like we're kind of like borrowing its underwear. I don't know. I mean, I'm not even sure so what Robert wanted to do was Robert's like, actually, what I think we can go do is I can hit this memory mapped region for the I2C controller, and I can force this thing, because the host CPU is up, I can force this thing to initiate I2C transactions and see if the SP can respond to these I2C transactions to identify like memory. Which
Yikes.
I was like, wow, okay. We are really desperate. And we, and even Robert's like, yeah, this feels a little too adventurous. I'm like, that definitely, like my CD broadcast to CB signal can just sit down. If you're going to do this, this is definitely next level. That was coming into this while it was already kind of evolved. So Will, I think you were among the first on scene on this to discover that the service processors were down. What was kind of and you were attempting to do, we're kind of supporting another issue, and you all noticed that like, oh my God, these things are all down. How did the kind of things proceed from there?
Do you want me to give us some context on like what the customer is seeing first?
Yeah, sure. That'd be great. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the customer reached out to us because they were trying to stop an instance via the CLI, and the request was timing out, which typically means that one of the sleds is down and like isn't able to respond, and so the request within the rack times out, and so the client times out. So we asked for permission to connect to the rack, and they let us in. And then we list all the hosts, and we can see that sled 23 is down. And then at that point we list all the SPs, just as kind of like a matter of course, just to like validate that the SP for that sled is there. And then, as you said, all of the sled SPs are gone. We still have the SPs for the 2 PowerShelf controllers and the 2 switches, but the other 16 SPs are just completely missing.
So like the list, like you're able to list them, and it's like, yeah, I have these 2 or 3. That's what you're looking for, right?
Yeah,
that's
those 4, right? Yeah, so the tool we use to list SPs is called Pilot, and that has like a streaming feature where you can just like show me all the discoveries you have, and so we use that next, and we can see it's only discovering the 4 that we see from the list, which makes sense. So we look at the MGS or Management Gateway Service logs next, and we can see that we're reaching out to all these SPs, and it's timing after 20 seconds and 5 attempts. So at that point, we reach out in the channel and say we don't see any SPs on this rack, and Matt and a number of other people hop in from that point to start to troubleshoot more.
And Matt, I'm sure you were like, you can't see, you've lost all of them. I mean, it definitely reminds me of that Far Side cartoon where it's like, we paid you to look after the children, and you cooked and ate them both when they are coming home to a wicked witch. I mean, it feels like we've lost all of the SPs. That must have been. This is not a failure mode that we've really. This really shouldn't be possible.
Yeah, I mean, to lose 1 SP could be seen as carelessness. To lose 27 of them, that's really impressive. Yeah, so at this point, I get pinged, and I'm like, oh, it's another quote-unquote management network bug, which is never the management network's fault, but, I got to go in and prove that to my satisfaction. And so I pop into the system, and we have pretty good counters invisibility to like what's going on in the management network, where I guess the context here is the management network is the separate switch which has all of the SP traffic, and then it has a bridge up to the main network. So we can use this. This is running before the main switch is running. It runs when the system is mostly powered off. And so we start looking at the counters, and sure enough, we see that we have packet counters for all of the SPs, and the packet counters are going up for the two sidecars and the PSC, and they are not going up for any of the SPs. So we're like, oh, well, that's a bad sign. That means that no packets are leaving the SP. And this all checks out, right? Because the whole point of the way that discovery works is that the SPs are periodically broadcasting a message saying, hello, I'm an SP. And if we don't see that message, then it doesn't get through. So the fact that the packet counters aren't going up is like, okay, that's understandable, but not great. So I actually, let me just see, I pulled out, unfortunately this isn't a customer support ticket, so it's a private repo, but I pulled out my long list of things that we did.
Oh yeah, I love that you were saying that. I actually was coming into this several hours of bad ideas in, so I cannot wait to hear some of the other ideas.
Yeah, Robert's like, let's cut off our own hands was like, that was the best idea.
That was exactly.
Yeah.
That was after several other ideas.
So one other thing we try is there's a command called IPCC, which talks to the SP over the serial port in the system. So that is like not using the network stack at all, obviously. And so we tried using that to talk to the SPs on these stuck sleds. And sure enough, they didn't talk over IPCC, the serial line, either. So at this point, I'm like, okay, something has gone wrong, and like the kernel has hung in all of these SPs, and maybe it's like a timer that has gone wrong or something like that. And I think Robert is like, well, can we just try to ping the SPs just to see if that works? And I'm like, sure, but that's not going to work. Like the whole system is hung. And so we figure out the IP address, and we try to ping one of the SPs, and the SP answers on ping. And we see the packet counters go up for like the two packets that it takes to do ICMP discovery and echo. And we're like, oh, the SP is still running. This is weirder than we thought.
Yeah, totally weird, right? Because
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that. I mean, I think because the expectation there is like when we are dead, that the SP is actually dead. The kernel is panicked or something as. So the fact that the networking task is like totally dead. So the fact that this thing can actually respond to ICMP echoes is kind of wild.
Something very weird is going on. The SPs are alive enough to answer pings, but dead enough that they can't seem to do anything else. And one thing we know about pings is that pings are actually handled within the net task itself. So it doesn't do dispatch to a different task. And what it seems like now is that like every task below priority 5, which is the priority of the net task, is not running for some reason. And we're not sure why this is happening. I point out that if the net task was always runnable for mysterious reasons, then it would always be selected, and that would cause the behavior we saw, but this is still in the like mysterious reasons category. We then, I think, Will, do you want to talk a little bit about the like thermal current debugging that we tried to do as well?
Sure. Yeah. So the SPs will collect metrics on current for the given sleds, and then we also have, and also from the power shelf controller. So we did this two different ways, and we can query the metrics within the kind of like the management system of the rack using OMDB, which is kind of an internal tool. So it's really easy to run metrics queries. So the first thing we did was we just queried for hardware current from one of the dead sled SPs, just to see like when did this stop, and we could see that it stopped roughly 25 days previously, and then we just repeated that for all the other sleds, and we could see they'd all failed within the space of I think roughly a day, and then we also and then we also checked for the PSC hardware metrics or current metrics, just to see like when the SPs died, did we see an increase in current indicating that the fans are kicking off? And it looks like we did see an increase in draw, which was suggestive of that. I don't know if we ever conclusively determined that though.
Yeah, we ended up seeing like a moderate increase in current, so not enough that the fans were like at 100%. So it was like mixed results. Like we saw something change in current, but it was not strong evidence for exactly what was going on. At one point, we were also considering asking the customer to go down to the actual data center and like car talk style, like describe the noise the server's making. Is it more of a woo or is it more of a woo? We didn't actually end up asking the customer to do that though.
But maybe we should, even in hindsight, we've got this thing completely debugged. Why not actually just like, I think, Matt, as long as you ask them in exactly that way, I feel we should, I like the various kinds of apes that we're trying to determine which one we're seeing.
The other thing we did at this point was take the number like 188.5, which was the rough uptime, and like look at it in milliseconds and try to turn it into an even power of 2. So we're like, oh, maybe something is rolling over at this point. And it turns out you cannot turn 188.5 days into like anything that looks like an even power of 2, right. Unfortunately.
Yeah, so we've got, and then but the host is up, right? So we also don't want to like, well, yeah, I mean, we don't have the ability to extract any more state other than we know. We don't need to do, or were there other bad ideas that before Robert wanted to write to device memory to use the, what were some of the other things that you guys...
We kind of backed off the device memory once we saw the ping working, because we're like, okay, like the SP is actually alive, which was what we were trying to prove by showing that it responded over SPD. I think the other thing that we hadn't done at this point is like, we had not proven that the SPs would come back, which was concerning.
Yeah. In terms of like, we don't know if the SPs are actually dead.
Yes, although by the time we saw them responding ping, we were maybe feeling a little bit better on that front, but we were still like, if we power cycle one of these sleds, like, and the SP doesn't come back, then someone is flying off to a certain location with a debugger and not going to have a good week.
Yeah, that's a very dark thought. I guess I came into this after that. That dark thought had not occurred to me that we had managed to actually like electrically destroy every one of the SPs. That would be that's dark. Yeah, that's definitely dark. Fortunately, so and I think we did end up resetting. Will, you ended up resetting the sled that was the cause of the investigation to begin with, and that thing did come back up. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. The next day, we got access to the rack again and power cycled it, and it came. The host and the SP both came right up. So that was a relief.
That's a relief. Okay. So now we have got really just the symptoms of this problem. It's obviously a very bad problem. We really rely on that SP being up. So we're kind of reduced to, I think, Matt, we've kind of exhausted the information we can get out of the running system. Or maybe there were some other ideas on other information we could get out, but we're kind of reduced to like, all right, we're going to need to kind of go from first principles and try to reproduce elements of this problem. You had the thought that I think a lot of folks had is like, could this be time related? Definitely reminds Adam of the L-bolt problem, the famous Unix L-bolt problem, where with L-bolt as a 32-bit value, and at its L-bolt is the lightning bolt variable that dates back to like 6th edition. They took very like odd poetic license at very odd times, like drop the E off of Creat and L-bolt as lightning bolt. But so this thing fires 100 times a second. This is the system clock. At 100 hertz, that value will become signed after 248 days. And kind of famously, Unix systems of a certain vintage could not stay up for longer than 248 days. And they would be up after 248 days. It's just that it would be absolute madness of people thinking that their timeouts that were in the future were in fact in the past, and a bunch of stuff would break. This is all like in the 90s. And actually one of the first things, the first thing I actually did at Sun was actually fix that. That it was kind of someone else had kind of already started that work and was kind of handed to me.
It's like a classic job to like send to the new guy too, because you're like, how hard? Like, this doesn't seem that hard, and I'm sure then like your phone was ringing for years or whatever on this critical code path.
It was funny actually on that in particular. Like that work had already been broadly done, and they also wanted to allow the hertz value to be tuned, to be configured, and they had decided that the senior engineers had decided that the values that were acceptable were 100 and 1,000. So 100 hertz and 1,000 hertz. And I'm like, why not just allow it to be configured to any value? Like, well, that'll be kind of unsupportable. Like, that feels like that should be supportable. So I just cranked the values higher. So what I would do is I'm just going to crank the value until the machine no longer boots because it's just running the clock interrupt all the time, which was super satisfying, strangely, to do that. It was like, I don't know. I think that there's something sadistic in software engineers where we kind of enjoy computers that are in pain at some level. So, and I, in particular, remember that on Sun 4C, this is campus. This is an old machine at this point. I don't know what the clock rate was on that thing. I could get it to 26,000 and it hung at 26,000 hertz. And I came back the next morning and I was very satisfied that it hung. And I hit the carriage return and verified that it hung. I guess I did that the night before because I came in back the next morning and it was actually making progress. It was executing some very small number of instructions at a time. And then the machine immediately panicked. And it panicked on what ultimately was a chip bug that we found. Wow. Yeah, which is crazy. And as it turns out, when you set the processor interrupt level, there was a 2 instruction window immediately after that, where you could take an interrupt at a level lower than you just set the interrupt level to. And that was a chip bug. As it turns out, it was a chip bug in every Spark microprocessor they had made up before UltraSpark. So, it was kind of an interesting lesson in a whole bunch of ways. One, that the consequences of just time in general, these problems that you have that you only see with uptime, right? That are really hard to test for. Because how do you you have to just wait. And obviously there are ways to do this and there are ways to kind of jumpstart time. I mean, Matt, that was one idea you had, was around time. And did you end up doing the experiment of trying to accelerate time closer to this value that of course is not even power of 2 to see if anything breaks?
No, we had talked about just booting the system with the clock set to 188 days, but didn't actually get around to that.
Didn't around to it, yeah. So it's kind of this is a high priority issue, but we're kind of noodling around on how to all right, God, what to do. And then Cliff, you picked this up. It's well, this seems like a high priority issue, obviously. What was your approach in terms of because this is a tough one to kind of go from first principles on?
Yeah. So I had been out for a chunk of this dealing with family stuff. And so I get in and I have text messages waiting from a bunch of these folks being like, hey, so there's a weird thing. Hey, there's a weird thing. We'd really like you to look at the weird thing. Oh my God, could you please look at so anyway. But fortunately, by the time I got in, a lot of this prep work had already been done. And the stuff that Matt and folks investigated really narrowed down the potential failure space. So by the time I showed up, what we knew was essentially machine goes unresponsive to everything except ICMP ping, which, as Matt mentioned, is handled on a fast path inside the network stack. So that can keep working sort of like a brainstem reflex, like a chicken with its head cut off, long after the rest of the computer is doing something else. And Matt also mentioned earlier the possibility of the net task being really busy or doing something in a loop. And so that was sort of the leading hypothesis, but we didn't know what would cause that or why it would be doing a lot of work in a loop. So Hubris has some interesting properties and tools here that actually came in really handy. And this we need to model the operation of the system in our heads because we can't get information in or out of the computer because it's that borked, is the sort of situation that guided the design of a lot of the system and tooling. So what we had was, from the build system, we could get a graph showing the priority relationships of all of the IPCs between all of the tasks. And from that, we could clearly see that the IPCC handling, the serial port to the host, was a lower priority than the network stack, as are all of the clients of the network stack by design. The Hubris network stack is a little weird, but it's a separate task rather than being in the kernel. And tasks that want to offer a network service are lower priority than the network stack, which means whenever the network stack has an opportunity to run, it wins. It will take the CPU away from any of its clients. As a fairness thing, mostly. But in this case, the IPCC was also lower than the network stack. So if the network stack were running with wild abandon, it could explain why all of these interfaces are down except for ping. The other thing that seemed plausible at the time, though, was one of the ways a task in Hubris can burn lots of CPU is to crash a lot, because our default response, generally, as an unattended system, is to restart the task. Now, Matt recently actually added a sort of smart timeout to give a cooldown period whenever a task crashes before it gets restarted. But I believe that this customer was on an older release, and I wasn't confident that code was there. So that was a possibility, was that it was just falling over a lot. So we had to sort of rewind. And the good news is like, thinking about this after the fact, there's a bunch of problems we didn't have to chase that would have been wild goose chases that we might have had to do on earlier systems I've supported. Like, this was probably not a wild pointer misuse in a different task, because we're pretty confident the memory isolation between the tasks works at this point. It's probably not a scheduler bug, because the scheduler is super, super simple. So I had to...
Yeah, and just on that, but especially on the wild pointer, because I think this is so important, because when you have the possibility of kind of arbitrary corruption from arbitrary things,
right?
You've got this kind of like, well, magic happens, and sometimes there's bad magic in this system, and we don't understand why, and therefore, like, certain things are unknowable.
So supporting complex C firmware for a long time is the reason why I know what it looks like in a hex dump if a pointer has been replaced by an IEEE floating point number. That's the sort of thing that happens.
Right.
So
having this, that is I mean, not only do we have the solace that doesn't happen, but that also gives us a kind of resolve that, like, this is, like, there's something else going on. Like, we can't just chalk it up to bad magic due to something having a straight pointer.
Well, as you say, data corruption is almost undebuggable. That is to say, you're separated at such a distance. We talked about this last week, and the ramifications are almost arbitrary. So it does give you some license to feel like giving up as an option.
Totally.
Yeah. And data corruption is sort of like the, well, I guess it was ghosts of software engineering.
Exactly. Very unsatisfying.
So for better or worse, don't really get to reach for that one. So we instead stepped through everything sort of rigorously. And I started with the kernel looking for potential scheduler bugs, but the scheduler is really simple, and we didn't find anything there. So I started looking for things that might cause the network stack to crash. Because if it's crashing, it must be crashing for a reason. It's probably a panic because it's Rust. Like, that's basically how we crash. And the number of actual panics in the network stack code is pretty low, although I did run off on a couple of tangents chasing ghosts that wound up not bearing any fruit. But we pretty quickly narrowed it down to the idea that the network task was probably failing to correctly acknowledge an interrupt. So hardware peripherals on machines like this, on these microcontrollers, indicate some condition to software by signaling an interrupt, which causes an interrupt handler. It basically interrupts the flow of instructions through the computer. And in our case, a small routine runs in the kernel to handle the interrupt and pass it off to a task outside of the kernel for further processing, in this case, the network stack. So if the stack were getting an interrupt from the network controller and was failing to, like, clear the condition, then as soon as it tried to go back to sleep, the kernel would receive another interrupt and would thwap the network stack again, and you'd wind up in this cycle where the network stack basically receives all userland cycles instead of the computer ever idling. But it wasn't clear what could be causing that, because we've had this Ethernet driver for years, and it's generally been pretty reliable, and there weren't any obvious interrupt sources we wouldn't be clearing. So I had to go read the manual again, and buried in the manual in an unexpected location of the. Let me just double check the page count here.
And Cliff, can I just ask you something about your methodology here? When you say, I'm going to go read the manual again. So the manual for the microcontroller is thousands of pages long.
I just looked it up. It's 3,294 pages.
Which is a good thing, to be clear. I believe,
nice.
I believe in our episode on transparency and hardware software interfaces, I've called out ST as a model in this regard. So love having this much documentation. But when you say I'm going to go back and read the manual, are you, clearly the documentation on the Ethernet controller is slimmer, but it's like, I mean, it's probably hundreds of pages, is it not? I mean, it's got to be.
Yeah, the Ethernet chapter is only 300 pages long. And
oh my God.
I think the other problem with the Ethernet chapter is that there are several interrupts which are listed as enabled when the chip is reset, and that is just straight up a lie. Like, we were going through this and we found, it says these interrupts are enabled, and they're not enabled when the chip is reset.
Yeah, the chapter is effectively crying wolf. There are 3 or 4 different interrupts where it asserts in plain English, this is enabled by default, but it's not. But it turns out one of those 4 actually is enabled by default, but the only way to confirm this is with this diagram that's hidden on page, 2000 in Mumble that I posted on the GitHub issue that shows that this one interrupt source for every other interrupt has this AND gate that like masks it if an interrupt enable isn't on. This one interrupt source instead has an OR gate that doesn't allow you to mask it ever. So,
what is? I mean, may I? Are we taking questions at this time? Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Join me.
Why? Yeah. So that was as confusing to you. That would be. We'd have this particular interrupt is maskable.
That's pretty bonkers. I mean, so normally the sort of convention on an ARM microcontroller like this is that the central standard interrupt controller has enable bits for every interrupt source, and sometimes something like an Ethernet controller will combine a bunch of sources internally into a single bit that goes to the central interrupt controller. So in our case, from the CPU's perspective, Ethernet produces one interrupt, but it's a combination of like 24 possible event sources. So the nice thing to do is to have bits in the peripheral that let you turn those individual interrupt sources on and off. The next nicer thing to do, if you have some of them that can't be turned off, is to have them connected to somehow optional and maybe a function that has to be turned on. So there were actually 2 stanzas in the interrupt handler and the Ethernet driver in Hubris that said, basically had a to-do, we don't enable this interrupt, we don't need to handle this. Which
is half true.
It's true. So it turns out to be all the way true. Folks had flagged that as an oh shit thing we need to look into, which is valid. But it turns out those interrupt sources actually aren't enabled by default, despite what the book says. So those 2 are fine. There was a third that we didn't know about that was not listed in the Ethernet interrupt section of the manual that turns out to be the thing that's actually on by default. And it's the, if I can jump to the spoiler, it's the management counters interface on the network interface controller. So it's this block of things which we skipped over because we're like, management counters, that'd be cool someday. But it's probably fine, right? Counters, that doesn't sound dangerous. What would go wrong with a counter if we don't do anything with it? Yeah, so the answer is there's one of the counters is responsible for counting packets in and out. And by default, when that counter reaches its halfway value, it lets you know it's going to overflow by causing an interrupt. There's no way to turn this off. Actually, it did turn out there's a way to turn it off, but it's really hidden in a different register.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess thanks for letting me know that thanks for killing me by letting me know that this is like a fire breathing canary. I'm trying to figure out again what the metaphor is for this, but and so it fires the interrupt when the counter is halfway at its halfway mark. which also feels like pretty aggressive.
Panicking. Come on, man. Like you're halfway there.
So you're halfway there. I mean, the glass is like, isn't the counter literally half empty? Like, why are you? You're complaining that it's half full.
So Cliff, can you walk me through the
can.
steps? So then you get the interrupt, and then what happens?
So in this case, because there was no software to handle the interrupt, what happens is the kernel interrupt handler runs as usual. The kernel notices that it's from the Ethernet controller, sends a notification to the Ethernet handling task, the net stack. The net stack wakes from sleep, looks at its notifications, and says, "Oh, I've got an interrupt. Great. Let me go run my interrupt processing code." Doop-de-doop-de-doop-de-doop. So it goes through a whole series of reading device registers and looking at bits in them and trying to figure out what actual hardware event caused this interrupt. And it runs off the end of the code because it didn't think to check the one register for this thing we hadn't turned on. So then it says, "Great, I've handled the interrupt. This must have been spurious," because that does happen. I'll just re-enable the interrupt, which it does. Go back to sleep. And as soon as it goes back to sleep, the kernel says, "Hey, you got an interrupt." And then the whole thing the day is right over. So the failure was interesting because what we basically had was a network-activated time bomb in every service processor, and actually in the switch, in the sidecar switch and the PowerShell computers. All of them had this time bomb lurking. But we'd never seen it, kind of, because we usually hit the machines before they hit this counter. But in hindsight, we had a couple of infrequently used dog food systems that would mysteriously fall off the network. And we never really knew why. But I think now we know why.
Cliff,
it's also
fair. Is it fair to say that this feels like it could be lurking in every consumer of this, right? Like this counter is so buried, the documentation does not make it clear. In some cases, it's wrong. The pathology waits for a gajillion packets or whatever, or half a gajillion, excuse me.
Right.
Like, could this be lurking in like everybody who thought they've properly implemented something on top of this?
Right. I'm not accusing this construct of being enemy action, but if it were enemy action, what would it look like?
Yeah. So I actually was wondering that too. So I went and checked every open source driver I could find for the Ethernet block on this microcontroller. And it's not a super popular microcontroller, but it's kind of popular. So there were several code bases I could check. And in general, every code base I found tended to have a commit usually months after the original version of the code that sheepishly went in and turned these bits off. So people are hitting this in practice, but they're hitting it faster than us, which then sent me down a whole like, why are we so late to the party here? Like, why are we getting bit with this at a customer site when other people, like the Rust embedded HAL driver for this Ethernet controller actually fixed this in 2022, I think. So,
interesting.
Yeah, and I think the reasons are kind of a side effect of the system robustness. If we get a failure like this, the only symptom is that, like, oh, wow, it dropped off the network. In a normal system, having an interrupt storm like this means the entire computer locks up, all interfaces stop working, you have a brick. Yeah. And it's a lot more obvious when you're having this class of system failure. And with our systems, it's just like, well, I don't know, maybe the cable to this one PSC is flaky. We should probably reseat the cable and move on. And
then you reboot it and reseat the cable, and the problem's gone.
Yeah. Yep. Or you. Yeah.
I also do wonder if the other folks using this microcontroller, because if we don't see this is not like a network device. You know what I mean? Like, yes, we obviously the network's important here, but we are not like pounding the network all the time. Like if we were using this microcontroller you could imagine use cases that would hit this much faster than we hit it.
The management network on the rack is completely separate from the customer data network, and the amount of traffic flowing over it is relatively low and it's very controlled. It's all just our things talking to our things. It's also small packets. It's all UDP. It's very lightweight. So our packet frequency on that network is lower than probably your home Wi-Fi network. So we'll get to 202 to the 31st power packets sent a lot later than most people.
166 days later, apparently. From our,
yeah.
I said 186 days. Sorry, Matt, what the number was.
Yeah.
We've got this really interesting thing in the data sheet that you've discovered. What's next in terms of like how can we go explore this hypothesis?
Oh yeah, so I think I posted in chat saying I may have found a thing that we're not handling, but I need to look into this more because I don't know. I tend to be habitually uncertain about things, but I went digging in the datasheet and I found a test register in the Ethernet block, which lets you force the hardware to set the counters just below overflow. So there's actually
very helpful. Yeah.
In the controller for testing the overflow behavior without waiting for 2 to the 31st packets. So once I saw that, it was like I was worried I was going to have to run the thing overnight, spamming it with packets. But no, I just went in with a debugger, and I mean, I know it sounds like in the kernel debugger you would consider this a bug, but I used the debugger to write a device register to force this bit on, and then pinged it 16 times, and the thing hung up with exactly the behavior we would expect in production, or we were seeing in production. So that was a strong indicator. And then if you do humility tasks at that point, you can see all the running tasks, and net is always marked as running. Idle never runs. So it's not yielding the CPU.
Yeah, and I mean the great thing is that you've reproduced this, because when we are in a compute sled, certainly in a customer site, but even a compute sled that's just in a rack, we don't have a debugger plugged into that thing. Like the header's populated, but we don't actually. There's not so when the network is actually our only way to understand what's going on inside that service processor, you have now reproduced this on the bench where you actually have a debugger attached to it, so we can use the serial wire debug interface and we can actually understand heaven and earth about what this thing is actually doing.
We can ask it arbitrary questions, even though its network interface is down. Because the nice thing about these embedded debugging interfaces like JTAG and serial wire debug is that they're not cooperative. They will work even if the computer doesn't want them to. It's also why we don't have them plugged in at a customer site, because that would be rude and give us lots of weird powers over their computer. But on the bench,
as an aside, I can't remember if we mentioned it here before or not, but I do feel like one of the things I love that we have done is that we have used the serial wire debug and this incredible robustness of it. It really is a very robust mechanism, and as you say, it's not an opt-in mechanism. This is how the root of trust can control the service processor on our machine. The root of trust actually has that SWID line, and it can actually control the service processor and force it to attest itself and do all sorts of other things, which is extremely useful.
Yeah, on boot, the root of trust actually stops the service processor, alters the contents of its RAM, forces programs into it and makes them run, and verifies that they ran in a way that the hardware cannot lie about. So that was Rick's idea a long time ago, and boy, has it been a delightful hack. It's really quite powerful.
It's damn good. Yeah, it's a damn good idea, and it's been really robust. But it all goes to this. Certainly, I understanding Cortex microcontrollers was a first for me at Oxide, and really appreciating the robustness of that SWID interface. It's very, very helpful to have something that's so robust there. So, all right. So you've now reproduced it. We've got the symptoms, and then so what's the fix? I mean, it feels like do we just actually let this interrupt know that we're actually not? No, I guess we can't mask it, so we've got to actually deal with it.
Yeah. So once this interrupt goes off, you have to figure out which of about a dozen different bits in different registers you would have to set to make it stop happening. There's a whole tree process you have to follow of read the top level register and see which bit is set, and then go read a different register depending on what bit is set, and then da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And we could do that. But it also turns out that there are bits you can set in a control register to just turn this feature off. We don't use the management count. Yeah. So the code I added is about 30 lines of comments and 2 lines of Rust. So this is actually on by default, and here are the bits we have to set, and here's the code to set them, and now the interrupt shouldn't occur.
Amazing. And I mean, I think that on the one hand, and Cliff, I mean, as one would, I mean, you said, look, we can't say conclusively we found the issue, but boy, we found an issue that matches everything symptomatically. It does feel like we've got a high degree of confidence that this is the issue that we saw in production.
Yeah, like the simultaneous failure is really okay, I'm a little bit of a ghoul, so one of my favorite parts about this failure is the fact that it was simultaneous. Because if it had been sled, we probably wouldn't have had this focus, and we wouldn't have been able to rule out really simple, basic things. But the fact that it was an approximately simultaneous failure of every machine in this class of machines in a rack was a big wake-up call of like, it's either a bad packet on the network, or it's power supply issue, or it's something across all of them. And what it actually turned out to be is just the fact that a lot of our management traffic is multicast. A lot of our access patterns over the management network to these compute sleds are uniform, which means if they all start up at about the same time, their packet counters have about the same value.
And in fact, we did the math on this afterwards, where we were seeing, somewhere between 100 and 150 packets per second, multiplied by 188 days. This is a case where it actually does line up with the nice round power of 2. So that was another confidence builder that this was the right diagnosis.
Right. There was just the conversion
that
we had to discover to convert between seconds elapsed and number of packets sent. And then it's a nice power of 2.
Yeah, that is absolutely wild. And I mean, this is one of those, and I feel like we've had this, many times, where you've got these symptoms. There's somehow we are going to explain these symptoms, and the simultaneity is like, God, there's something that's going to explain that. What could it possibly be? And I mean, Cliff, I thought this was very surprising. I mean, ultimately, of course it makes complete sense, but it was also not, we really got there from Godonkin experiment and then careful reading of the data sheet, not thinking like, oh, there's probably some networking counter that's interrupting incessantly somewhere. It was I don't know, maybe you were less surprised, but I felt it was definitely surprising.
I was honestly mostly focused on the fact one that originally missed the existence of this interrupt when I was writing the Ethernet driver. So, it's sort of a bug I created several years ago without realizing it.
Well, they're all, aren't they all? But I also feel that like it's, and this is where because we have not used the kind of vendor source code for this stuff. We don't use the embedded house. We have gone our own way, which does require us to own this stuff at a deeper level. But I don't know. Yeah.
One of the things I suggested in chat when I was sort of self-post-morteming this was it probably makes sense for us to periodically go take a look at the other open source drivers for our peripherals, because for a bunch of technical reasons, we can't use the vendor drivers. We can't use embedded HAL or most of the Rust ecosystem drivers. And it's simply that they generally don't assume they're running on a protected mode operating system. They don't assume that their interrupts go through an IPC system. They don't. There's a bunch of assumptions they make that are valid for 99% of users, but are not valid for us. So in the absence of being able to just share the bug fixes, we need some kind of communication channel to make sure we at least hear about them.
Yeah. And how? Yeah. So there's a question in the chat: have we notified ST that the docs are wrong? No, we probably should do that. ST's been pretty. Pretty as these things go, pretty receptive. I view ST as kind of a model for pretty good transparency here, and generally pretty good documentation. I know that it's in this case it was misleading or wrong.
So the answer here is a little complicated because ST, to their credit, tends to release very comprehensive docs on their microcontrollers. They also never update them unless, I don't know what you have to do to get them to update them. They will release errata sheets that explain that, oh, by that way, that feature we're still advertising isn't implemented. But what they won't do is a release an errata sheet for a thing that just kind of sounds misleading. So it's actually not clear that ST has a policy that would result in this getting changed. This has been reported to them by I posted this on Mastodon. Several people reached out saying like, "Oh yeah, that bug. Yeah, man, I remember that bug. That sucked." And they all reached out to ST. ST's aware, but like ST's position is, "Hey man, we described this in the manual, and like, yeah, maybe you don't find the pros as accessible as you'd like, but it's not a bug per se, and you do keep buying our chips." So, I'm maybe a little cynical there, but I don't think that there's an obvious pathway to getting the manual updated. What we can do, though, is publish this in as many forms as we can, which is part of why I took a bunch of the notes and wrote up that public hubris GitHub issue in addition to...
And if anyone wants to point us to other podcast episodes from other companies talking about their firmware bugs, we will gladly listen to absolutely all of them to make sure that we... because I do think that this stuff is extremely valuable information to share. And I think it also just underscores the importance of having open source, because in a closed proprietary world, and we do work with vendors where like all of the source, where the documentation is proprietary, and so it makes it a lot harder to find problems like this or to go validate them. So the transparency here is a win and is helpful. It's just not totally sufficient in this case. Well, this is awesome. Actually, I do love the fact that we were talking about this. Megan was asking this morning, is like, do we need to should we like issue a patch for a previous release on this? Like, well, no, because we know that it actually is going to take a while to hit this. So, by the time they hit this, we'll have them updated to the most recent version. So, it's actually very helpful that this. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, if a customer doesn't want to upgrade for another half a year, then we may want to push out a patch, but we don't think anybody's really, insisting on that. So,
yeah. And then the mystery of sled 23, which is what kind of caused all this, that's going to be a future podcast episode. So stay tuned. We've been on a bender recently of oversharing fascinating bugs, but we just seem to be hitting more and more content generation. This is great. Cliff, again, extraordinary work on this. And because for all, I mean, this, I'm not sure if there was some hidden work here, but you actually debugged this remarkably quickly once you hit the data sheet. Felt like it was.
It took a few hours of concerted work, but I want to emphasize that, like, I was just knocking the pens down that Matt and Laura and Will and the other people that were working on this before I got there had set up.
And once again, I think this has been a theme on these other bugs too. We got the kind of the baton being passed, so everyone taking their turn with the baton. And this was another good one, and really terrific work. Very exciting to get this fix in. Adam, I for one would like slightly less content generation, even though this is terrific content. Like, right. we can ease up. I feel like, if the gods are listening,
that's right. On one hand, debilitating bug. On the other hand, podcast episode solved. But
episode solved. It is.
But we're going to be off for a couple of weeks, so we can just pause on some of the debilitating bugs.
We can pause on some of those. So and actually speaking of upcoming weeks, so we're out next week, but then the week after is going to be our last episode of the year. So, that's wrap up time. We're going to do our wrap up episode. So that's going to be exciting.
Yeah.
Which means we will be doing a title and image review. So just want to.
That's right.
Not too much pressure on anybody. But
I assume that episode's just going to be chime sounds the whole time.
So that is actually a bit of an over question. I feel like it is an act of cruelty to have it just nonstop chimes, but it will be a lot of chimes. I think, or maybe no chimes.
Maybe we'll get them all in at the beginning or something.
Exactly. We're not actually we don't actually hate the listener, even though sometimes our audio behavior is no.
It's a much more complicated ambivalence. Yes,
it's a much more complicated relationship. Exactly. Well, again, terrific work, Will, Matt, and Cliff, and I said other folks that had worked on this problem, and Robert and Laura and others, but really, Justin, a lot of great work all around, and fun to have another podcast episode. But we don't need to have any more world gods. You can actually, it's okay. Things can actually work now. Now that we've dealt between Future Lock and our data corruption episode, and I also like to see we kind of like hit on all. Like, why am I say this? Why am I like literally tempting the gods with the other? I'm just going to shut up now. We know the gods are listeners.
Yeah.
So.
Were you about to say like we never seen a bug in this subsystem?
No, I sure wasn't. So awesome. Well, Cliff, thank you very much, especially for joining us and great work debugging this. And we'll get the word out there for other folks that may have this part, and let us know if there are other issues that we should be aware of. Definitely let us know. So thanks, everybody, and we will see you next time. So in 2 weeks, and bring some of your highlights. We'll be doing our year wrap up. See you next time.